9 discusses the sentencing and punishment component of the court system. We're going to talk about the history of punishment. We're going to talk about the goals. We're going to talk about the types of models for sentencing. And we're going to spend some time talking about capital punishment. Now, let's start with the history. Punishment, the punishment and the, well, say, correction of criminals has changed over time. What do you think causes these changes? Age, customs, economic conditions, political point of views or political views in general, and religion. These are the things that affect punishment and correction over time. In the early times, we'll call them the ancient times or the Middle Ages, punishment was quite severe. You could be banished, exiled, required to forfeit your property, because that's all that people had was land or property. They could be fined. If you couldn't pay, you'd be subjected to corporal punishment, maybe whipped or branded. And these then developed into, or these prior punishments developed into our what's called the common law. We spoke a little bit about the common law. The Old English law developed in the 11th century. And let's say at that time, it brought a more standardized practice for punishment. The emphasis was to maintain public order. But this resulted in the wealthy being able to buy their way out of punishment, and the poor subject to brutal corporal punishments, and even death for the littlest of things, theft, for instance. And the big thing was putting the punishment on display to the public. And it was important to do this because the point was to attempt to deter crime. And those types of things, beheadings, hangings, stoning, hand cutting, eye for an eye, you steal, you lose a hand, whipping, exposure, just being left out to the elements, public shaming, firing squad, beatings, torture. There was a torture crank machine that people had their legs and arms tied out and then cranked around a wheel and pulled apart. Those were some severe types of punishment. In the 16th century, we saw cities growing, and then the overseas colonies were formed, and this resulted in trade and a market system. And there was a need for labor. So what better way to punish criminals than to make them do hard labor? And this is where they rounded up the poor and the vagabonds, vagrants. They scooped them all up and they put them to work, regardless of what their crime was, to petty theft, to assault, minor things. And they had to work off their punishment, hard time, hard labor. And then we saw the rise of the prison. One more quick note, however, for our hard labor workers, that just didn't happen in England. Those folks were also shipped off to colonies to work off their debts too. And because it was so severe, the hard labor, some people killed themselves to avoid it. When they were there doing hard labor, they were treated bad, they were abused, they were starved, and guess what? It was a very profitable business for colonies. The American Revolution ended the transportation of, we'll put them in quotes, air quotes, slaves to North America, but continued elsewhere until about 1875. And populations grew with the revolution. Transporting criminals had stopped. The use of machinery came into play, replacing hard laborers, or the need for laborers. So now the question was, what do we do with criminals? Well, I went back to the corporal punishment and the death as a resolution. And then they were using jails and types of workhouses for the petty offenders. But the hardcore criminals couldn't be kept there. At one point, they kept hardcore criminals on abandoned ships, but because of deteriorating conditions, that did not last very long. So they had to find a place for these hardcore criminals. In the 1820s saw the creation of penitentiaries or prisons. The term is used interchangeably now, penitentiaries, prisons. And they began replacing this physical punishment in England and in America. Penitentiaries were for the folks who were felony offenders, and they had to serve more than 1 year. Otherwise, they were in the jails or the workhouses. Give you a little background on penitentiaries. New York's oldest penitentiary, still in operation today. It is the Auburn Correctional Facility. It was built in 1817. It is a maximum facility. Prisons are ranked per the person's crime and the length of time they have to spend. A maximum facility is for someone with a very long criminal history or serious felony conviction, like murder, right? Child sex offenders go to maximum facilities. The most famous one, the most famous prison that gets its recognition, however, as the first penitentiary in New York State is Sing Sing, which is in Westchester County. And it's really the most notorious, famous prison in New York. It was constructed in 1825. It had hard laborers at that time working to build it. They used the hard labor workers to build it. It was finished in 1828. It is really the first prison to embody the harsh and extreme nature of the prison system. And that's a reputation that this particular prison hasn't really come off. They haven't shaken off that reputation. It was deemed the death house because it had 614 electric chair executions, which also included 8 women that took place between 1891 and 1963. They had quite a, not to go off on a tangent about Sing Sing, but they had a whole slew of most notorious prisoners there, including various members of the mafia. But we'll talk more about correction facilities when we talk about corrections, which will be in our next section. But incarceration remains the primary mode of punishment for serious offenders. There's been a supervisor supplemented portion for the less serious offenders. Some states still have the death penalty. So incarceration remains the primary mode for those serious offenders. For less serious offenders, there's a lesser, we'll call it, depending on the length of the term. If it's less than a year, they're going to be in some local jail. But there are minimum facilities for those lesser serious offenders. And as I said, some states still recognize the death penalty. So the question I pose is, does the United States have the highest prison rate or the most populated prisons? What do you think about that? Is that true or false? That is true. The United States highest prison rate and have the largest prison population. We'll talk a little bit more about reform in a little bit. So let's talk about goals of modern sentencing. Okay. There's 5 areas. We're going to talk about them individually, but I want to pose to you a case you might have heard about in the news. If you have not heard about this case in the news, you can watch the attached video. There's a video in the additional materials about the defendant, Larry Nassar, who was sentenced to over 100 years in federal prison for sexually assaulting female gymnasts. It was a very big case. He was the doctor for the Olympics and numerous female Olympians, and over that time while he was their physician, he sexually assaulted them. I bring this up because I ask, how do you feel about that? After you've watched the video, if you need a little bit more information about it, Google it. There's a ton. Heinous crime. Did he get what he deserved? I think he got like 100, close to 100 years. And the judge said during sentencing, I just signed your death warrant. Because basically he will die in prison with a sentence like that. Do you feel sorry for him? Did you say, good, he can't harm anyone else? These are the things society thinks about, right? What are the goals for sentencing? When a judge sentences a convicted individual, the following 5 areas is what they consider. And the time parameters for the sentence are set by statute. So, if we're talking about one specific crime, that one specific crime has its own incarceration period, like 3 to 7 years, 25 to life, that sort of thing. And, when somebody is charged and convicted of many crimes, then they can stack. That's where you get, 75 years in prison or 100 plus years in prison for each particular crime. But the judge has to consider these things: deterrence, incapacitation, retribution, rehabilitation, and equity. So what is deterrence? There's 2 components to deterrence. There's general and there's specific. General is generally people will be afraid to commit a crime because they're afraid of being punished. The harsher and more certain of the sentence, the more the crime is deterred. Okay, the point is to keep crime low and deter society, those people who live in society, from committing crimes. And they do that by having harsher sentences and people knowing what that sentence is. Certainty. People don't commit murder because they don't want to spend the rest of their life locked up, because that's what would happen if you intentionally go out and kill somebody. But on the other flip side of that, it can't be so harsh, the sentence, the punishment can't be so harsh that it is disproportionate and unfair, says the Constitution, right? The 8th Amendment. Can't be so harsh and disproportionate. You don't put somebody in prison because they stole some cereal from the grocery store, right? Doesn't fit the crime. But you also can't have a nothing to lose but commit the crime. The book has a good example. If somebody, let's say, rapes somebody else, if the punishment for raping somebody is the death penalty, then what does that person have to lose to then just kill the person that they just raped? You're going to get the death penalty anyway, right? There's the risk in that doesn't deter them one way or the other. Because, well, I just raped somebody, so I might as well kill them too. It's the same sentence, right? Experts believe that crime rate is dropping due to severe punishments or increased punishments, or when there's an increase in penalties if there's a prior conviction. So today, as you may be aware of, as we just talked about, hopefully you remember, there is a great rate of conviction. Why do we have a great rate of conviction today? Plea deals, plea bargaining. I told you in the last section, we just talked about in the last section, that over 90% of cases end in plea deals, meaning people are saying, I'm guilty of this crime and getting some sort of punishment. So there's a great rate of conviction. And also, we have technology, which is helping in the assistance of solving crimes. It's still not, there's still some problems with solving crimes, but most of the time, crimes are being solved with the help of technology, forensics. We have DNA. So deterrence, specific deterrence, I should say that was general deterrence, deterring the general public. Specific deterrence, that's focused on the offender, where it's deterring the offender to not repeat his or her crime. They face the pain of the punishment the first time, and they learn their lesson. That's what the point of specific deterrence is, or that's what the point of this one goal is of deterrence. It has two components: general, deter the general public, and specific deterrence, deter the offender from repeat offending. And if they do repeat the second time around, the sentence becomes harsher. However, unfortunately, research suggests that specific deterrence is not necessarily the case. It's actually, the research shows that it's more likely somebody will reoffend after having a conviction for a serious crime. Why do you think? Because now, with a conviction, the person has a criminal record. It's hard to get a job with a criminal record. They return to the area where the crime happened, or they have a belief that crime is worth doing it. So the research suggests that the specific deterrence is not clear or not working. Incapacitation. Does confining dangerous criminals eliminate the risk of their repeating their offense in society? Does confining these dangerous criminals, the point is to keep dangerous criminals out of society, incapacitation. So the question is, does it reduce the crime rate? And there's mixed research on this point. There's a number of factors that affect the crime rate, as we talked about. And on the flip side of that, it's very expensive to house inmates. But this is another goal: to deter, incapacitation, keeping the dangerous criminals out of society. Retribution. The punishment should fit the crime, quote unquote. Think of it that way. The punishment should fit the crime. The punishment should be no more or no less than what is deserved based on the defendant's conduct. Example: mother steals food from the grocery store to feed her starving child. That's example one. Example two: woman enters Walmart, puts cosmetics in her handbag, and walks out. She has been caught on a previous occasion and got off with a warning. She did it again. But should our punishment fit the crime? What kind of punishment in either one of those scenarios would fit the crime? Would you be a little bit more lenient on the first example than on the second example? These are the things that the judge looks at: deterrence, incapacitation, retribution. The second example, there might be a little bit harsher sentence than the first example, because I told you she had done it before and got a warning. Didn't get in trouble the first time around. But how do we determine what's fair? Right? In that case, they both stole something. But how do we determine what's fair? Is this the circumstances? Man rapes a 10-year-old girl, beats her to death, and tosses her body in the river. Woman comes home early from work to find her husband and the woman from next door in bed together. She grabs a gun from the nightstand and shoots them both, killing them. How do we determine what's fair? Both killed people. Do we look at under the circumstances? Or should they both be given the same sentence? Right? In the first two sets of examples, people stole, woman stole. And in the second one, killed somebody. I guess I said two people. I guess you'd give the second one a harsher sentence because there was two people involved instead of one. But maybe let's just say one. She just shoots her husband and lets the neighbor go. Does that change things? The next goal is rehabilitation. Can this person be rehabilitated? Can they be under some supervision and be out in the community and not locked up, right? Under this goal, it's, the application of proper treatment is so that the offender is no longer a threat to society. Types of examples, someone who has a substance abuse issue or a mental health issue. They're usually not incarcerated, depending on the crime. And they get supervised. Who supervises them? Probation. We'll talk a little bit more about them when we talk about corrections. Parole, you might have heard the term parole or probation. These folks help someone, if they don't have a high school education, to get their GED. They help find employment, find housing, get their treatment issues taken care of. So there's some level of supervision. And that's another goal and something else a court considers when sentencing somebody. Can this person be rehabilitated in some fashion? And then equity, restitution. This is the goal of compensating the victim or the state for losses suffered as a result of the illegal conduct. So if we're dealing with like a property damage offense or somebody stole something, reimburse them, pay for the damage, pay back. Some instances, the federal criminal system does this all the time. Requires the person to pay for the cost of the case and the whole prosecution. If it's an assault case, there might be medical bills that need to be paid for. Trauma was suffered, mental health treatment to be paid for out of the pocket from the defendant. So equity and restitution, another goal. Other impositions under this for sentencing, there's fines. That money goes to, the local county, depending on where the crime has occurred. If it's a felony, it'd go to the county. The money goes to, if it's in one of our local courts, it'll go to that town or that city. But the money goes to the locale to assist with crime. There's community service. In some instances, the forfeiture of the defendant's property. For example, a drug dealer who's caught with a wad of cash from a drug buy, that money could be deemed forfeited. So those are the areas that a court must take into consideration when imposing a sentence. These goals. This is the goals of modern sentencing. They are reviewed every time a court has to sentence somebody. So now we're going to talk about the sentencing models, the types of models we have here in the United States for sentencing.